So let us discuss about treaties, okay? Let us discuss about treaties, okay? Now, of course, what's the definition of a treaty? So, if we're going to look at the definition of Justice Cruz, well, a treaty may be defined as a formal agreement, usually but not necessarily in writing, which is entered into by states or entities possessing the treaty making capacity for the purpose of regulating their mutual relations under the law of nations. So, in the generic sense, the term treaty may embrace such agreements or compacts such as conventions, declarations, covenants, acts, concordants, pacts, etc., which have recognized variations in their extent or purposes. So all such agreements, when intended to create legal as distinguished from moral obligations, are binding on the parties. Okay. I think I would discuss it in this later slides, but of course, when we usually in the generic sense, when we speak of treaties, usually it's done by two or a few state parties or other parties which are possibly subjects of international law. But if it is an agreement among and between a mass of nations or a mass of states, usually we usually have this configuration, or we usually have this concept of a convention, 'di ba? So for example, 'di ba, yung sa human rights natin, 'di ba, yung mga convention for the protection for political and criminal for the protection of civil and political rights, or yung sa CEDAW. These are conventions which the parties are comprised of several states. Okay. Now we have to go to, of course, in relation to this definition, is the definition under Article 2A of the Vienna Convention on the Law on Treaties. So a treaty, according to the VCLT, is an international agreement concluded between states in written form and governed by international law, whether embodied in a single instrument or in two or more related instruments, and whatever its particular designation. Okay. Now, of course, what would be the governing laws on treaties? So, of course, there are before the 1969 VLCT and its amendments, treaties are governed primarily by custom. Okay. There are our previous discussions on diplomatic and consular law. Okay. Most of the formalities on treaties, their origins are from customary law. So this has been duly established or duly emphasized through state practice. Okay, most of them would be through state practice. All right. Then we have now the 1969 Vienna Convention on the Law on Treaties. So the VCLT was said to a large extent to reflect customary international law, albeit with the addition of a few salient novelties, such as, of course, the notion of jus cogens. Okay, the Vienna Convention, or the VCLT, has become the leading instrument on the law on treaties, even though it limits its scope to treaties concluded within states. Okay, now treaties concluded between international organizations are governed by the terms of the 1986 Vienna Convention, or with or between international organizations. So this latter instrument, while not in force, it itself largely to reflect customary international and follows the 1967 convention almost to the letter. Okay, but for purposes of our discussion, we're going to hark back with the 1969 VCLT version. All right. Now, of course, insofar as Philippine jurisprudence is concerned, what is the difference between a treaty and an executive agreement? So this has been discussed in several cases, notably in the VFA cases. This has been discussed a little bit. There is also this case of Bayan versus Zamora ba yun? Of course we have Bayan versus Zamora, but there's also a recent Bayan versus Executive Secretary case. Okay, so of course, insofar as Philippine state practice is concerned, Section 2 Executive Order 459 Series of 1997 provides the following definition. So an international agreement shall refer to a contract or understanding regardless of nomenclature entered into between the Philippines and other government in written form and governed by international law, whether embodied in a single instrument or in two or more related instruments. Treaties, on the other hand, are international agreements entered into the Philippines which require legislative concurrence, okay, after executive ratification. This term may include compacts like conventions, declarations, covenants, and acts. Then we have executive agreements which are similar to treaties except that they do not require legislative concurrence. Now, international agreements involving political issues or changes of national policy and those involving international arrangements of a permanent character usually take the form of treaties. But international agreements embodying adjustments on detail, carrying out well-established national policies and traditions, and those involving arrangements of a more or less temporary nature usually take the form of an executive agreement. So an executive agreement is not a treaty insofar as its ratification may not be required under our Constitution. However, the distinction is purely municipal and has no international significance. So from the standpoint of international law, treaties and executive agreements are alike in that both constitute equally binding obligations upon the nation. So just to give a perspective, of course, when we speak of treaties, usually these are the ones being concurred by the Senate. We're going to discuss that under Article 7, Section 21. Executive agreements, on the other hand, they usually do not require the concurrence because, well, for all intents and purposes, this might be agreements which are more or less, these are usually more or less, not that, although it is also significant, but the significance is not that major, but still it is important that these executive agreements do exist. So for example, remember that we are a member of ASEAN, okay? We're a member of ASEAN. Most of the unless if there is really a covenant that requires all the members of the ASEAN to sign, most of the time, usually ASEAN and ASEAN member states, they enter into executive agreements within one another. This does not really go to Congress, but for purposes of expediency and compliance with, particularly these are more or less economic agreements. There is, of course, the point of sending it to Congress might slow down or might hamper the transaction. That is why executive agreements are being allowed in order to accommodate matters which, of course, the Philippines can act upon immediately, especially if the agreement is important, especially within the concerns of Philippine economic viability or economic commerce. Executive agreements are allowed, okay? Right now, what are the functions of treaties? Okay, so of course, to enable parties to settle finally actual and potential conflicts. Usually, this is after war or after a potential conflict has been made. Okay, to make it possible for parties to modify rules of international customary law by means of optional principles or standards, to pave the way for the transformation of an organized international society into one which may be organized on any chosen level of social integration, and to provide for the humus or yung parang fertilizer for the growth of international customary law. Okay, and of course, requisites of a valid treaty, of course, it should be entered by parties. It can be two or more, okay, having the treaty making capacity, and it should be done through their authorized organs or representatives. And of course there should be free will. It should be without the attendance of duress, fraud, mistake, or other vice of consent. Of course, the treaty should be made on the basis of a lawful subject, and this is also in accordance with their respective constitutional processes. And of course, the parties to the treaty, of course, there's this negotiating state, and then we have contracting state, then we have a party, of course, then we have third state. Okay, it might be a party not to a treaty, diba? Then we can also include international organizations. So anyone who has this juridical capacity to enter into this treaty, you have international capacity. That is why we go back to this discussion on subjects and objects of international law. It is it would be a state to state or a non-state actor but is imbued with personality that can enter into a treaty. Okay, all right. So of course, authorized party representation. So if this for municipal law to determine which organ of the state shall be empowered to enter into treaties on its behalf. So in this country, it is the president who is vested with the power, but no treaty, or of course according to Article 7 Section 21, no treaty or international agreement shall be valid and effective unless concurred in by at least 2/3 of all the members of the Senate. So this is in consonance with the general practice of assigning the negotiation of treaties to the executive department of the government, usually through the consent of the legislature or one of its branches. So what would be the legal effect of this treaty concluded by an organ of the state? Okay, of course, a state is not bound by the treaty made by its behalf by an organ of an authority not competent under the law to conclude a treaty. Of course, there are other views. Okay, so of course, you have to note the draft law on treaties discussion by the International Law Commission here. Okay, so the fact that a provision of an internal law of a state regarding competence to enter into treaties has not been complied with shall not invalidate the consent expressed by its representative unless the violation of international law was manifest. Okay, you should note that later on in ratification this would have a similar discussion, that it's not necessarily that if it's not a member of, or if there is a question as to the competency of the parties to enter into contracts. Okay, the default idea is that there would be no vitiation or no violation of any consent, or the entering is valid unless there are blatant international law violations. Okay, all right. Okay, so of course, in continuing with this discussion, of course, we have Article 7 now of the BCLT. So a person is considered a representing a state for the purpose of adopting or authenticating the text of a treaty of those for the purpose of expressing the consent of the state to be bound by a treaty if he produces appropriate full powers, or if it appears from the practice of the states, okay, or other circumstances that their intention was to consider that person as representing the state. Okay, so of course the VCLT also provides that of course the following may be considered as one representing the state. So of course if a head of state or a heads of the government or ministers, or of course in our case Secretary of Foreign Affairs, this can be considered as representing the state. Then we have heads of diplomatic missions for the purpose of adopting the text of a treaty between the accrediting state and the state to which they are to be accredited. Then representatives accredited by states to an international conference, to an international organization or one of its organs. So minsan nagpapadala yung Pilipinas ng ganyan, 'di ba? For the purpose. So kung naalala niyo noon, 'di ba pag you would hear this in the news, 'di ba, example, magpapadala na example, may meeting sa Paris Agreement o may amendment sa mga international agreements. Usually we send representatives from the DFA. Usually merong order yun, may formalities yun for them to accept. Okay, all right. Then we have Article 8 of the BCLT. So an act relating to the conclusion of a treaty performed by a person who cannot be considered as authorized to represent the state for that purpose is without legal effect unless afterwards confirmed by that state. Okay. And of course, the two basic principles of treaties. This was discussed by one of the authorities, si Jan Clavers. Okay, so the law on treaties is based on two foundational principles according to him. So, of course, there is this concept of the free consent of states. Then, once consent is to be bound and has been expressed between the parties, the treaty has entered into the force. Okay, the treaty shall be kept by the parties in good faith. So, yun yung concept na sinasabi ko, yung pacta sunt servanda. Once in force, treaties are supposed to be performed. This too is said to follow from sovereignty, but stress the responsible side of sovereignty, premise as if on the thought that states know of what they are getting themselves when concluding treaties. Treaty making is an emanation of sovereignty, and the responsible sovereign sticks to his word. Okay. And of course, steps and formalities in our treaty making process. So we have negotiation. Then, of course, when we speak of negotiation, of course, the parties will negotiate the terms and conditions of the treaties. Would there be any considerations? Would there be any other side, or there might be other concerns that may be included? This will be part of your negotiation. Then of course you have the signatures. Of course the signature is primarily intended as a means of authenticating the instrument and symbolizing the good faith of the contracting parties. Significantly, it does not indicate consent where ratification of the treaty is required. Okay? So, but that is, of course, that's useful. So, but where ratification is dispensed with, the signature will operate to bind the parties to the treaty. Then you have this concept of an alternate. Okay, an alternate is an arrangement under which each negotiator is allowed to sign first on the copy of the treaty, which he will bring home to his own country. The purpose being to preserve the formal appearance of equality among the contracting states and to avoid delicate questions of precedence among the signatories. Then, of course, we have the ratification. So, ratification is the act in which the state formally accepts the provisions of a treaty concluded by its representative. So, the purpose of ratification is to enable the contracting states to examine the treaty more closely and to give them an opportunity to refuse to be bound by it should they find it inimical to their interest. Okay, while most treaties now expressly provide that they shall be subject to ratification, the majority view is that the requirement would still hold true even in the absence of a provision of this effect in the instrument. Hence, unless ratification is properly dispensed with, and more so if it expressly requires an unratified treaty, cannot be a source of obligation between the parties. So, of course, there is this legal obligation to ratify a treaty. So, no legal obligation, but the refusal to ratify a treaty must be made on substantial grounds. Otherwise, the other party would be justified in taking offense. At times, to avoid a total rejection of a treaty, the ratification is qualified or made conditional, that is, with reservations if allowed. Then the final step would be this concept of registration to the United Nations. So, according to Article 80 of the VCLT, so treaty shall, after their entry into force, be transmitted to the Secretariat of the United Nations for registration of filing and recording as the case may be, and for publication. Then we have this concept of reservation. So, of course, what is reservation? In a treaty, you can have reservations to be made of record. Especially these reservations are not that common as to bilateral or trilateral treaties, like for example BFA. Syempre walang reservation yan kasi syempre there are just few parties, but usually when we speak of we speak of reservations, syempre pag bilateral treaties, it's not that rare, 'di ba? It's not that rare. It's that rare pala. Yeah, it's that rare. But most of the time reservations happen with conventions, 'di ba? Like CEDAW or ICCPR, 'di ba? Or the favorite discussion here is the Genocide Convention. It's usually done when the treaties are conventional in nature, okay? So, reservations. So, reservations are unilateral acts by which, individual states wish to modify or exclude part of a treaty, okay? So, this is relevant because it allows states to commit themselves at no cost. It allows them to join regimes without having to make dramatic domestic policy changes if they do not want to, and is thus a tool for flexibility, okay? So, what would be the legal effect of a reservation, okay? A state which has made and maintained a reservation which has been objected to by one or more of the parties to the convention, by not to others, can be regarded as being the party to the convention if the reservation is compatible with the object and purpose of the convention. So, otherwise, the state cannot be regarded as being a party to the convention. So, this is the advisory opinion on the Genocide Convention. So, just to make it a little bit simplified, doesn't necessarily mean that if you made a reservation, you're not going to be automatically disallowed or be removed as a member of that convention. But of course, the reservation can be made, of course, subject to the condition that it should be compatible with the object and the purpose of the convention. Okay, so otherwise, the state cannot be regarded as being a party because you're going to contradict the purpose of entering into such convention. Okay, then of course we have this concept of entry into force. So in Article 24 for the VCLT, treaty enters into force in such manner and upon such date that as it may provide, as the negotiating states may agree. So failing such provision or agreement, a treaty enters into force as soon as consent be bound by the treaty has been established for all the negotiating states. When the consent of the state to be bound by the treaty is established on a state after the treaty has come into force, the treaty enters into force for that state or that date unless the treaty otherwise provides. And then the provisions of a treaty regulating the authentication of its text, establishment of the consent of states to be bound by the treaty, or the manner and date of its entry of force, reservations and functions of the depositary, and other matters arising necessarily before the entry into force of the treaty apply from the time of the adoption of its text. Okay, and we now go to termination or suspension of treaties. So treaties may be terminated voluntarily or involuntarily. Insofar as voluntary circumstances are concerned, of course, withdrawal is a form of a voluntary circumstance. So this is usually under its provisions. Of course, when we speak of a treaty, just like you try to imagine it as a contract, of course, when we speak of treaties, the parties here are states and possibly non-state actors, but which has personality. Okay, so of course, in the treaty, okay, in the treaty itself, there might be provisions for the withdrawal of the provisions. It might be under the provisions, or usually this is under the consent of the parties. Okay, then we have this denunciation or withdrawal, which of course this may be possible with no provisions under the treaties. Then suspension under its provision and consent of the parties. Of course, the last one would be breach. If there would be a breach of the treaty, of course, the breach would be something which would, of course, nullify or would really rescind, or of course there would be an adverse legal effect on the part of the existence of the treaty if there would be a breach of such treaty. Okay, then we have now involuntary circumstances. So what are these involuntary circumstances? So of course we have this concept of reduction of members below the entry. This happens in conventional law. Okay, kasi syempre when we speak of entry into force, there is if we go back dun sa concept na entry into force, you wait for the numbers, diba? May numbers yan para magkaroon ng entry. Like for example, if you're going to read the history of the UNCLOS, may required number of members para magkaroon ng entry into force yung UNCLOS. Okay, so UNCLOS was signed in 1982, but UNCLOS has to wait until 1994 in order to have an entry into force effect, that there would mas matibay yung binding effect niya dun sa mga signatories dun sa UNCLOS. Okay, alright, then we have supervening impossibility of performance. Then we have this concept of fundamental change of circumstances, or yung rebus sic stantibus, the severance of diplomatic or consular relations. Then of course, the new one would be the emergence of a new peremptory norm of general international or jus cogens. Okay. Then of course, when we speak of course, in relation to this, of course, the discussion on pacta sunt servanda. So every treaty in force is binding upon the parties to it. It must be performed by them in good faith. So that's your pacta sunt servanda. So the principles of pacta sunt servanda, or this includes the principle of your free consent and of good faith, okay, which are universally recognized as a general principle of international law. Then we have this concept also on internal law and observance of treaties. According to the VCLT, a party may not invoke the provisions of its internal law as justification or its failure to perform a treaty. Okay. Then we have this concept now of rebus sic stantibus. Usually these are discussed mainly on your text. So it's when we speak of Latin terms on treaties, we have pacta sunt servanda and rebus sic stantibus. Okay. Yeah. So okay. So rebus sic stantibus. Okay. So actually may full term pa nga yan. I think it's clausulam rebus sic stantibus. But of course, that's the same. The point is the same. Okay. So this concept is defined as well. This would justify the non-performance of a treaty obligation if the conditions in relation to which the parties contracted has changed so materially and so unexpectedly as to create a situation in which the exaction of performance would be unreasonable. So one example cited by Justice Cruz, okay, in his book is, of course, let's say if states A and B agree on the reciprocal use of their respective port facilities, and B's only important port is thereafter required by State C, State A would be released from continuing to accord the treaty privilege to State B, which is no longer able to fully perform its obligations under the treaty. Of course, this concept of rebus sic stantibus has limitations. Of course, it applies only to treaties of indefinite duration. The vital change claim as to the justification for the discontinuance of the treaty must have been unforeseen or unforeseeable and must have been caused by the party invoking the doctrine. Then the doctrine must be invoked within a reasonable time from the concurrence of the change asserted. And finally, the doctrine cannot operate retroactively upon the provisions of the treaty already executed prior to the change of circumstances. Okay. Then, of course, this one is, of course, with respect to book citation. But as to the VCLT, we have Article 62 of your VCLT. So, of course, there is already this already, the one that I just mentioned, this has been already codified under your Article 62 of your provisions on rebus sic stantibus. Okay. So here we have three concepts. Okay. These are now the controlling treaty provisions under the VCLT. Okay. Then, of course, consequences as to the invalidity of the treaty. Of course, under your Article 69 of your VCLT, a treaty, the invalidity which is established under the present convention is void. The provisions of a void treaty have no legal force. Now, if acts have nevertheless been performed in reliance on such a treaty, each party may require any other party to establish as far as possible their mutual relations, the position that have been existed if the acts have not been informed. Then, of course, if the acts performed in good faith before the invalidity was invoked are not rendered unlawful by reason of only the invalidity of the treaty. Now, in cases falling under Article 49, 50, 51, and 52 on fraud, corruption, and coercion under the VCLT, the foregoing does not apply with respect to the party which the fraud, the act of corruption or coercion is imputable. Then, in the case of invalidity of a particular state's consent to be bound by a multilateral treaty, the foregoing rules apply in relations between that state and the parties to the treaty. And of course, we have Article 70. Well, unless the treaty would provide otherwise or the parties would otherwise agree, the termination of the treaty under its provisions shall, of course, release the parties from any obligation to perform the treaty. Then it does not affect any right, obligation, or legal situation of the parties creating through the execution of the treaty prior to the termination. Okay. Then we have the new concept, the termination based on a peremptory norm of international or based on jus cogens under Article 71. So it is void if it is in conflict with jus cogens norms, and the party shall, of course, eliminate as far as possible the consequences of any act performed in reliance of any provision which conflicts the peremptory norm or the jus cogens, then bring their mutual relations into conformity with the peremptory norm of general international law. Now, if a treaty becomes void and terminates when a new peremptory norm emerges, the termination of the treaty releases the parties from any obligation to perform the treaty, and it does not affect any right, obligation, or legal situation the parties created through the execution of a treaty prior to its termination, provided that those rights, obligations, or situations may thereafter be maintained only to the extent that their maintenance is not in itself with conflict with the new peremptory norm of general international law or jus cogens. Then we go to our discussion. Of course, Philippine state practice. Of course, remember that in our constitution we have the incorporation clause and the transformation clause. So your incorporation clause, it's your Article 2, Section 2. So this incorporates general principles of international. Of course, this is very much related to treaties. Remember that if the Philippines would sign a treaty, of course, the concept of pacta sunt servanda, which is a general principle of international law, would apply to us. So we cannot just, break or not comply with the treaty automatically. Because remember, as has been discussed in this lecture, of course, parties are required to observe pacta sunt servanda, or exercising the obligations under treaties in good faith. Of course, if there would be no good faith assumption of obligations, of course, more or less that might be more of a breach, or there might be a bad faith on the part of the party, and that might be violating that treaty. Okay. Then of course, issue on ratification, we have the Youngstown framework. Okay, so remember that the Youngstown framework is not necessarily an it is more of a note that the Youngstown framework is more of a test to determine whether or not there must be a check and balance between legislative and executive prerogatives among the three branches of government. Okay, this is not necessarily international law thing, because remember the reason why there was this Youngstown framework, there was a discussion because of this case of Pangilinan versus Cayetano. If you note, diba, this is the case where President Duterte withdrew from the ICC. Okay, he withdrew from the ICC. Pangilinan filed a petition before the Supreme Court challenging, in essence, that the president cannot unilaterally get out of the Rome Statute. Okay, note that if one would enter into a treaty, there must be a ratification. Now, of course, Pangilinan and his co-petitioners would contend that, well, because they would contend that, well, since there must be a ratification from Congress, it follows that any withdrawal from the treaty should have been also with ratification by the legislative department. Okay. Problem was, if you can recall, the ICC accepted the withdrawal. So practically the case became moot and academic. Okay, it became a moot and academic case. However, the Supreme Court, in its symbolic, function, they discussed the Youngstown framework as a sort of a guideline for future cases. Okay. So of course, your Youngstown framework provides for three categories of executive action as to regarding the necessity of concomitant legislative action. So we have three categories. So category 1 is when the president acts pursuant to express or implied authorization of Congress. His authority it is at its maximum, or it includes all that he possesses in his all right. Then we have category 2, when the president acts in absence or either a congressional grant or denial of authority. He can only upon his own independent powers, but where there is a zone of twilight in which he and Congress may have concurrent authority. In other words, kung may gray area na pwedeng gumawa ng discretion ko lang ang executive department, 'di ba? Okay. 'Di ba? The distribution is uncertain, okay? So he can only rely dun sa powers niya. Okay, siyempre whether or not it's going to be grave abuse of discretion is another story, but you have to, of course, if the Supreme Court will be confronted with an issue like that, they have to check if the president has that power. Okay, now, of course, we now go to category 3. So when the president takes measures incompatible and express and implied will of Congress, its power at its lowest ebb. So he can only rely upon its own constitutional powers minus any constitutional powers of Congress. So essentially, si Category 1, okay, pag pareho may power. Category 2, kung may discretion ko lang presidente, of course, it depends on what act is going to do. Category 3, kung talagang silent siya or talagang may incompatibility dun sa acts, of course, you have to look at the constitutional matters or issues, okay? Then, dito sa Pangilinan, there is this discussion sa lex posterior derogat priori rule. Okay, note that this is a doctrine mostly applicable sa PIL. So, usually, ginagamit ito pag may conflicts between a rule on international law and municipal law. Okay, previous to the Pangilinan decision, lex posterior derogat priority is being applied insofar as economic or commercial treaties are concerned. Example, yung mga tax treaties. Heavily invoke itong lex posterior derogat priori in order to determine the applicability of commercial treaties or taxation treaties. Okay? Then we have this case of Secretary of Justice versus Lanchon. May dineclare kasi sila doon na pag mayroon siyang statement doon that of course a treaty may repeal a statute and a statute may repeal a treaty. Okay? If we're going to follow that proclamation or declaration, we have to go back to this case of Ichong versus Hernandez. Diba doon sa Ichong versus Hernandez, there is this proclamation by the Supreme Court that, you know, any law, because in Ichong there is this discussion on police power. The Supreme Court is clear there that if a law emphasizes the exercise of police power, it cannot be bargained away with a treaty. Diba? Yun yung practical na sinabi doon sa Ichong versus Hernandez. So, if we're going to compare it with the Secretary of Justice versus Lanchon pronouncement, it seems that it has overturned Ichong. Okay? The Supreme Court clarified that the statement in the Lanchon case is, well, it can be considered only as mere obiter dictum. Okay? Because a treaty cannot really repeal a statute and a statute cannot repeal a treaty. Insofar as the hierarchy of our law of our issuances are concerned, a statute would be superior insofar as a treaty is concerned. That is why, of course, treaties are susceptible to be declared as unconstitutional, diba? In the first place, because it's more susceptible, because if a statute may be declared unconstitutional, more or less a treaty can be declared unconstitutional because a statute is superior to a treaty. Diba? If your statute would be that of a police power measure, with more reason that it's higher above that year. So, ang parang clear lang na Supreme Court here is that, well, ang level pa rin na statute is still higher than a treaty. It cannot be equal to a treaty. So they clarified the statement in the Secretary of Justice versus Lanchon case. Okay, so that is it. So that is my discussion on the law on treaties.